Well, good afternoon. Well, as director of Thousand Oaks Library, it's truly a pleasure to head up what I call the pearl of our city. And I wanted to let you know that this upcoming January, we're going to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Thousand Oaks Library. Yeah. And the library has always been such an esteemed part of the community, and the numbers that we have coming in to use the library, whether it's coming in electronically or coming in person, just continue to show what a marvelous library we have. And when we began this program 5 years ago, we had no idea that it would be as successful as it is. We should have known, because this is a real library community, but it's just such a delight to see you all here, to know that you're taking part in this program. So we thank you for that, and would you please give yourselves a hand for taking part in it. I particularly want to thank the City of Thousand Oaks, as well as the Friends of Thousand Oaks Library. Both the city supports us so well, and the Friends play such a part in this particular program. So my thanks to all of them. And speaking of the City Council, the library would not be the library it is today without the support of our City Council. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce one of our own council members. He's no stranger to any of you, I'm sure. He's been involved in community activities for probably 40 plus years, which is a real trick since he's only 45 years old. But please help me welcome Council Member Dennis Gillette.
"45 years old, don't I wish?" I was just thinking about a situation that occurred a couple of years back. My wife and I were on our way up to the Monterey coast, and she wanted to visit the John Steinbeck Museum in the city of Salinas. The city had just tried to pass a bond measure to finance their library system. It didn't pass, and at that point they were contemplating, and they were working on, they actually did, close down the entire library system in this city, including the Steinbeck Museum. That same weekend, the City of Thousand Oaks celebrated a $20 million expansion to the children's section at the Thousand Oaks Library. It gives you an idea of the priorities that this community places on its libraries, the importance to the culture that we enjoy here in Thousand Oaks, and the kind of support that the government, local government, and the community working together have been able to create. And with leadership like Steve's, it's going to continue for a very long time. I'm optimistic. When we open a book together, we close it in greater harmony. That's been the theme Thousand Oaks Reads, and we found how true over the last 5 years. It's hard to believe this program has been going on successfully that long. Oh, so many of our programs, I wish they were that successful. It's been 5 years since the Thousand Oaks Reads. The City Council is proud to support this program, and we thank all of you who have embraced the One City, One Book program. We thank you for following a boy on his quest through New York to make sense of his father's death after 9/11, extremely loud and incredibly close. Thank you for wandering through Africa with the Lost Boys and witnessing the horror of battle-torn country and of making a new home in America. What is the what? Thank you for traveling to Los Angeles and experiencing the wonder of friendship and musical genius in the face of mental illness and homelessness. The Soloist. Thank you for being transported into the proud woman's fight for her home and wolves in the midst of the Great Depression in the hills of Kentucky, sweeping up glass. And this year, the hotel on the corner of Bitter and Sweet, we were swept up in one man's memories of war-torn Seattle and how he forged a bond of friendship that transcended the prejudices of old world ancestries and the separation brought on by forces beyond his control. These programs don't exist unless they are strongly supported, and your presence here this afternoon testifies to the kind of support that these programs get in our city. So on behalf of Andy Fox, the mayor of the city of Thousand Oaks, the city council and staff, and the 127,000 residents of the city of Thousand Oaks, thank you so much for coming and continuing to support this program. Thank you.
Okay, one of the unique and wonderful partnerships that we forged over this last 5 years is with California Lutheran University. And the person who's largely responsible for making that happen is Dr. Jim Bond. If you've been here to any of our previous programs, you will recognize him, and we're thrilled that he's back with us. He is an associate professor at Cal Lutheran. He hosted a very wonderful panel discussion with several other professors while they discussed many of the themes in Jamie Ford's book. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Jim Bond.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to all of you for coming today. This 5th year of Thousand Oaks Reads has reminded me of how important it is that we continue to support community programs that bring people together to engage with books, ideas, and reading. Earlier this week, I was talking with a close friend of mine. Her name is Kirsten, and she is someone I've known for about 20 years. We went through grad school together. She became an art history professor in the Cal State system, and I became an English professor here at home at Cal Lutheran. And over those 20 years, Kirsten and I have talked frequently about the books that we love, about the passages from those books that move us. And we've especially talked about the ideas and feelings that those books set in motion in our hearts and minds when we reflect more deeply on them. I told Kirsten about the conversation we would be having today with author Jamie Ford. She couldn't make it today. And about Jamie Ford's refreshingly reflective book, Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. As we talked on the phone about Jamie Ford's book, we realized that although we were both grateful for the good schools and the many fine teachers we've had, what mattered most in our educational journeys as human beings were all of the many occasions we had talked about books with others, and books especially that we read outside of school, the books that we chose and the books that chose us. As I've talked with members of the Thousand Oaks community about Jamie Ford's quietly powerful book, I've discovered that this novel has chosen many of us, has engaged us, has moved us, has caused us to reflect more deeply. And I talked with Kirsten, my friend, about why this particular book has caused me to reflect more deeply. As I read the novel, I kept noticing all of the material artifacts in the book, all of the material artifacts that filled it, objects that were repeated and carefully woven into the fabric of the text. Henry's I Am Chinese button, the Oscar Holden record, Keiko's sketchbooks, the U.S. government identification tag attached to Mr. Okabe's coat, the Panama Hotel, and many others. It's chock full of material artifacts that trigger powerful memories in old Henry Lee in 1986, causing old Henry Lee to recall crucial events from his life. Jamie Ford uses these material artifacts to punctuate old Henry Lee's inner journey of memory, of loss, recovery of the past, and the rejuvenation of the self in the present. If we take the time to linger with an object, we can conjure up the past again, so much so that it becomes part of our lived reality of the present and asks us to engage in memory as an ongoing process rather than merely a product to be consumed in a rush of nostalgia. Memory is an active process, not a disposable product. an active process that can help us make new choices in the here and now, just as old Henry Lee does in 1986 in the novel. This is precisely what Jamie Ford offers us for our lives through the character of Henry Lee in Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Please join me in welcoming author Jamie Ford.
Thank you, thank you. Wow. Okay, this calls for a brief comment on social media. So if you'll indulge me, I have to take your photo. Okay. Everyone smile and say, Facebook. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, social media. Who's on Facebook? Yeah, it's everybody. Facebook has been an interesting venue to be an author. It's been an interesting place to interact with my fellow authors, but it's been a wonderful place to interact with readers and book clubs, and it's been an overwhelmingly positive experience until about 2 weeks ago. And I got an email from a woman through Facebook. And do you ever get those emails where you can just tell by the header how much caffeine the person's consumed that morning? You know, it's all caps and very animated. And I open the email, and it says, "You have to help me find an agent for my book." And I'm thinking, okay, you know, I'm happy to help anyone on their writerly journey. I've had a fair amount of success. I sort of feel like I'm in karmic receivership, and it's my turn to give back. And so I recommended some websites that were very helpful to me when I was starting out. And she emails me instantly, right away, and says, "You're not listening to me. My book is Girl with the Dragon Tattoo crossed with Dante's Inferno." That was kind of my reaction. I'm thinking, go strong with that. If that's your elevator pitch, if you can make that work, go for it. But, and so, I try to get her on her merry way, and she emails me again, within minutes and says, "You're still not listening to me. This book is my life story. It's all true." I don't know if you've read Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. This is where I start wondering if this woman's circling my neighborhood, with the handcuffs and the chloroform-soaked rag, and I get very worried. But fortunately, I kind of got her on her merry way. It's like, "Look, something shiny," and she runs off, and I don't hear from her. But the next day, this is the absolute truth. The next day, I get another email, and this time it's from a gentleman, and he says, "You have to help me find an agent for my novel." And I'm thinking, I must have said something in an interview, to generate this kind of response. And I'm waiting a beat for the next moment, and he says, "No one believes me, but I'm the son of D.B. Cooper." I'm not sure if everyone remembers this, the hijacker that vanished with a lot of money in the Northwest. And this time I was actually sort of curious, but I didn't have time to sort of engage the craziness of the moment. And so I just emailed him back and I said, "Respectfully, sir, I would love to help you. The only problem is I'm the son of D.B. Cooper." And I only had one son, and it was me. Thank you for being here. I have to say, this is not my normal authorly event. This is so outstanding, because for a debut novelist, truly, that debut novelists, their typical author event is that quintessential bookstore event on a random Tuesday night about 7 p.m., going head-to-head with Dancing with the Stars. That's like rolling a boulder uphill. It's a Sisyphean feat to overcome that. And I say that half in jest, but I did do an event, boy, it's been a little bit more than a year now, and I did it at this great independent bookstore in Washington, D.C., this bookstore known as Politics and Prose. And, I was so happy to be there, and my cousin lives in the D.C. area, works in D.C., and so I emailed him and I said, come out to the bookstore, support the family. And he emails me back and says, I'd really like to be there, but tonight Tom DeLay is dancing the cha-cha. So that was my humbling moment from the road, of which there have been many. And since there are so many of you here, I have to ask, and this pertains to interviews. And with Hotel, I've been fortunate to do a fair number of interviews, print and television, especially radio interviews. Radio interviews are really easy to do, and that's because, for the most part, I do them on my cell phone, and that's just how they're done. And my first radio interview was an NPR interview with Scott Simon, and I had this vision of going into, the steel tower somewhere and sitting behind the frosted glass with the old school ear goggles on, where the producer is in the wings going, 3, 2. But no, it's just me on my cell phone. And I'm always in a hotel room somewhere. And it's interesting about these interviews is that they're recorded live to tape. And what that means is I can be in my hotel room in Madison, Wisconsin, and I can be on the air live in Lexington, Kentucky. And then those interviews are disseminated to other stations. And it's interesting because I get emails from readers and they will say things like, I love that interview you did in Topeka. And I'm thinking, I've never been to Topeka. That must have been one of those interviews. But I did one in Portland, Oregon, and I'm in my hotel room, and I'm on my trustee's cell phone, and we were on the air live. And there was this tremendous moment of live radio that went just like this. Housekeeping. That's happened twice now. And I had the thing hanging on the door, which I've learned is strictly advisory. There's no enforcement of that, actually. So if you happen to be listening to NPR, wherever you may live, and you hear this interview where this woman brings me fresh towels, please email me. Let me know how that sounds, because I'm dying to hear that one again. Interviews. Another curious thing about interviews is, I guess it's not curious, it's somewhat expected. I do get asked a repetition of questions, and that's, part of that is an artifact of having a publicist who sends out a press kit that shepherds the discussion and also creates the illusion the person doing the interviews actually read the book. I never really want to know. But I do. I get asked the quantitative questions about Hotel. I get asked about the Japanese internment, or I get asked about race relations between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, or occasionally there'll be an intrepid line of questioning about the Seattle jazz scene as it existed at the time. And we're going to do Q&A, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions about anything. But what's really interesting and intriguing to me is that now that the paperback's been out for about a year, I get a lot of emails from readers, and the commentary I get from readers is quite different than the commentary I get in a review setting. Instead of quantitative, the reader's feedback is much more qualitative. And by that I mean the feedback I get in an email tends to be something like, "You made me cry." It's very heartfelt, or it's, "I'm still crying," or "I'm on Prozac, I can't stop crying." It's very, and I can see the time stamps for the emails, and it'll be like 2:37 a.m., so I know someone's finished the book and they found me and they emailed me. And that's really satisfying as an author, as a writer, to see readers, I guess, getting the emotional currency that's spent in the book, whether that's the bitter of the internment or the sweet of the love story. And at its core, Hotel in the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, it really is a very simple love story. And because I never get asked about that in an interview setting, I'm going to talk about that just for a little bit. Because love stories are these very peculiar creatures. And by that I mean, if this was a big Hollywood theater, and we were all here watching a tearjerker love story type of movie, when the lights come on, you can really see two distinct camps emerge. If you look around, you can see that one group, and they're fishing in their purse for Kleenex. And then you see the other group that's looking around bewildered, and they're thinking, well, that was a waste of $10, Where was the car crash? Where was the gun battle? I paid for an asteroid collision. I want an asteroid collision. And it's kind of it is a coarse generalization to say this, but we do, love stories, we get them or we don't. And we bring our own emotional baggage to the party, and we react accordingly. But really, when I thought about love stories, I do have a deep, abiding weakness for love stories. And it goes back to a very young age. I want to say the age of about 8 or 9, about a third grader. And at the time, I was living in this little town of Ashland, Oregon, which some people are smiling and nodding. It's a lovely theater town. But if you happen to be growing up in Ashland, late 60s, early 70s, we were blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, to have one television channel. This is before cable had reached the hinterlands, and there were no satellite dishes. And because of that, you just watch whatever's on TV. And so as a little kid, I watched some strange television. I did, you just hunker down and you watch. And I watched this movie as a kid. It was a typical ABC movie of the week. But this movie had a real strong, profound effect on me, and it really informed the kind of storyteller I would later become. And it was this movie called James at 15. Anyone remember this movie? Wow. My people are here. We are among you. James at 15, for those of you that don't remember, and I understand why, James at 15 became a critically acclaimed series called James at 16, because he got a year older, which was almost immediately knocked off the air. Because in the 70s, the number one shows were like Dukes of Hazzard and Hee Haw, and not a high point in our culture for drama. But James at 15 was about this boy named James. My given name is James, so I was kind of interested. And the movie was set in Oregon, so I'm doubly interested. And it was about this boy pining away for this impossible girl. And he gets the girl. But, in this very benign 70s kind of way. It's not the Jersey Shore or anything like that. It was so simple. But James at 15 didn't end there. James at 15 ended on this scene where James and his family are packing up and moving to Boston. And so it ends on this scene where, they've got the U-Haul packed and James is in the back of the All-American U-Haul, or the All-American wood panel station wagon that we all used to drive. And he's waving goodbye to his sweetheart who's on the corner waving back. And they just drive away, and they drive on down the street. And there was this sad, melancholic piano music, and the credits just started to roll. And that was the end. And I remember watching this as a little kid and just thinking, oh, love sucks. This is awful. This is horrible. And it was the first time I'd ever seen a complicated interpersonal relationship that didn't come from Disney. You know, the nutty professor was as deep as I went, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I was so caught up in these characters. I was so vested in the story that when that emotional train did not pull into that emotional station and I did not get the outcome I had anticipated, I was stricken to tears. And not even the dismissive little, it's my allergies, kind of a moment. Real tears streaming down my face. And in retrospect, I can picture my dad sitting next to me in his easy chair. There's plenty of gentlemen in the audience tonight. I'm a dad. I know there's a lot of dads here. And I'm going to give away a little secret, but every dad has some form of the dad list. Every dad does. And I picture my dad regarding his young son just kind of bawl at this cheesy movie of the week and take out his imaginary dad list and just think, football scholarship, no. Basketball, no. And as a result, not just of that night, but a lot of nights like that, my dad actually encouraged me to go into the arts, which, so it's like, I scored a writer's touchdown, Dad, But I did. I went to art school, graduated from art school, and I later became a writer. But it was one of those interesting moments, because I go to school the next day, and everyone at school is calling me James at 15. Hey, it's James at 15. Because they all saw the same movie too, right? We all had one channel. But they hated it. I loved it. And in a textbook moment of peer pressure collapse, I took that moment, that memory, that experience, I boxed it up and I tucked it in the attic of my mind, never to look at again. And I didn't look at that. I didn't think about James at 15 for decades until I was trying to figure out this thing called fiction. And it's really hard when you're a writer, and I'm sure there are plenty of writers in the audience. And when you're a writer, whether it's poetry or prose or song lyrics or memoir or screenplay, whatever you write, it's like being given a box of 1,000,000 crayons, and you have to choose which colors you're going to draw with. And I was at that point in my life as a writer where I was, I'm half Chinese on my dad's side, and I had never written anything with Asian American characters because I didn't think anybody really cared. I thought those would be very personal things. And I love history, but I didn't write anything historical because I thought that was the realm, I thought that was the bailiwick of nonfiction. And I do have an affinity for love stories. And I had never allowed myself to go there either. Because it's hard, because I'm a guy, and I have guy friends, and they all know I'm a writer, and we do the ritualistic things that the male species does, which is go to the sports bar and eat chicken wings, and they'll ask what I'm working on, you working on the next Born ultimatum? It's a love story, excuse me. How about those Mariners? And so I hadn't gone there yet. But where I did go around this time is I went with my then fiance, now wife. I went to one of these weekends for newly engaged couples, which I've learned is a bizarre social experiment. It's very, very much like high school all over again. It's very, you go and you're kind of looking at the other couples like, I give them 6 months, that kind of stuff. It's terrible. You can't help but pass judgment on your fellow humans. I feel terrible, and the problem with us was we were so much older than everyone else in the room. Everyone was still in college, just out of college, and everyone came up to us thinking we're like the host couple, hey, where do we sit? And we're like, we're in love too. You don't have a monopoly on love. But we went, and what they had us do was stand up and tell the Cliff's Notes version of how we first met. And so the first young man, a sterling young gentleman, he stands up, he turns to his beloved, And he says, and I quote, "Well, I woke up and she had my t-shirt on. I figured I better ask her what her name was." I'm not making it up. I wish I was. Yeah, it was very romantic. I think my wife actually fainted. I'm fanning her, and the heavens parted, and doves flew, and oh my. Yeah, because it does. It was, it was like the Kardashian 72-day wedding or marriage, because it goes around the room, and everyone's first date was like spring break, or it was a frat party, or Jello shooters were somehow involved, and it comes around to me, and I had to stand up in front of this very young group. I had to confess to this post-collegiate coupling experiment that I met my wife at that hotbed of swinging singles activity known as the public library. They did not clap and cheer. It was that patina of nervous laughter, like, haha, no, really, where'd you meet her? It was the library, and it wasn't singles night at the library. It wasn't wet T-shirt night at the library. I wasn't hanging out in the 300 section, hitting on strange women that cruised by. And for those of you that don't remember your Dewey Decimal System, the 300s is human sexuality. It was just the public library. And a year later, I proposed in a bookstore. I know. You see, that's when I realized I was not James at 15. I was James at 40. And I was this weird kid, and I just became a weird adult. But it really freed me up to write what I wanted to write, which was something that dealt with Asian American experiences, and everyone's are unique, and everyone's are personal to themselves and their family. And I just wanted to write something that reflected my experiences, my dad's experiences, my grandfather's experiences. And I love history. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I wanted to do something historical. And I did. I wanted to write a love story. And it's interesting because I found myself drawn to reflecting on the love stories that are very resonant with me. My favorite love stories tend to be like Casablanca, very sublime by today's standards. But I really like that decorum. There was something about the decorum of Casablanca where, the love on the screen, it's love is all consuming, not all consummating. And there is a difference, But I like that. And so Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, it's a very simple love story. It's the story of young Henry Lee. He's a Chinese-American boy sent to an all-white private school just after the bombings of Pearl Harbor. And he's sent by his parents ostensibly to become more American. And there he meets Keiko, a young Japanese-American girl. And together they form a very simple something. But fortunately, or unfortunately, or tragically, we have an institutional memory of the Japanese internment. So we know at some point in this story, Keiko's family, her community, ultimately 120,000 Japanese Americans and nationals are going to be taken away to camps and incarcerated for their protection, even though the machine guns point in and not out. And so we know at some point Henry's going to lose Keiko. And Hotel's also the story of Henry as a grown man, and he's in his 50s, and he's a widower now, and he's a guy just living with his lament, and he's looking back on that time, and he's trying not to look back at that time. And he happens to be walking down the street through Seattle's International District, through Chinatown, what's left of Japantown. He passes an old hotel that has changed owners. And the new owners discovered something interesting in the basement. She's discovered the belongings of 37 Japanese families that were stored there as they were taken to camp. And as these things are coming up out of the basement, he sees something that he's pretty sure belonged to Keiko. And in that moment, it forces him to reconcile the past and the present, and to think about the things he did or didn't do, the things he said or left unspoken about that time. And for those of you that haven't read the book, I'll kind of stop right there. I don't want to give away any spoilers. I did a book event in Spokane, Washington, and during the Q&A, this lovely woman stood up and in the body of her question gave away the entire ending of the book. And I thought the book group ladies around her were just going to rise up with their hardbacks and just beat her down. So I don't want to do that. But what I will do is I'll just read a couple pages here. And when it comes to doing author readings, I do keep it short. And I'm a bit of a minimalist when it comes to writing. I'm even more of a minimalist when it comes to reading. So I'm literally going to read a page and a half. And I do that for a couple of different reasons. But first and foremost is I have this highly unproven, unscientific theory about author readings. And one of these days I'll apply for a grant and commission a study and see if there's any scientific validity to this whatsoever. But it's my personal belief / paranoia that because we were all read to as children at bedtime, I have that fear, right? I'm going to look up and just be like, that's, some people have that fear of they go to work or to school and they're naked. My fear is I look up and everyone's just in comas. So I don't want to do that to you. It's hotel on the corner of bitter and sweet. And I do think there are equal measures bitter and sweet. This is some of the bitter. And I need to preface it as such. We're about 70 pages into the book. And at this point, we've met Henry, we've met Keiko, they've met each other. It's very clear that there's a simple affection going on. But what's going on in the greater Seattle area at the time, not long after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, the FBI are making raids into Japantown. And they're confiscating camera equipment and radio equipment. And they're arresting Japanese Americans and nationals that they suspect are likely candidates for spying and espionage. They're calling banks and asking for lists of customers with Japanese names. And Henry knows these raids have gone on the night before. And so he goes to school the next day, and Keiko's missing. And so fearing for her safety, for the safety of his friend, he cuts class, he runs outside, and he sees smoke billowing over the rooftops in the direction of Nihonmachi. And that's where we jump into this part of the story. In the heart of Japantown, Henry found the Ochi photography studio once again. He couldn't miss the young proprietor who stood outside on a milk crate looking through a large camera mounted on a wooden tripod. He was shooting in an alley that ran in the same direction as Maynard Avenue, where Henry saw the source of the fires. They weren't Japanese homes or businesses as he'd feared. They were large burning barrels and garbage cans set ablaze in the alley, fire and smoke pluming up and over the apartment buildings on either side. "Why are you taking pictures of garbage fires?" Henry asked, not sure if the photographer even recognized him. The man looked through Henry, and his eyes blinked as he seemed to remember. It must have been the button Henry wore. The photographer turned his back to his camera, his hand shaking. "They're not burning garbage." Looking down the alley, Henry could see people coming and going from the apartment buildings, throwing things into the burning barrels. A woman yelled out of a third-story window to a man below and threw down a plum-colored kimono that looped and swirled, settling like falling snow on the dirty, slug-trailed pavement of the alley. The man below scooped it up, regarded it for a moment, hesitated, and then threw it on the fire. The silky fabric lit, and burning pieces floated out of the heat like butterflies whose wings caught flame, fluttering on the draft, flickering out, and raining down as black ashy dust. An old woman brushed by Henry with an armload of papers, throwing them into the fire that made a whooshing sound. Henry felt the rush of heat on his cheeks and stepped back. Even from a distance, he could see there were scrolls and artwork written and drawn by hand, large Japanese characters disappearing into the heart of the fire. "Why are they doing this?" Henry asked, not fully understanding what he was seeing. "They arrested more people last night, Japanese all over the city, all over Puget Sound, all over the state maybe," the photographer told him. People are getting rid of anything that might connect them to the war with Japan. Letters, clothing, it all must go. Too dangerous to keep. Even old photos, people are burning photos of their parents and of their families. Henry watched an old man wearily place a neatly folded Japanese flag into the nearest burning barrel, saluting it as it burned. The photographer snapped the shutter on his camera, capturing the scene. I burned all my old photos last night. He turned to Henry, the tripod shaking as he held it. With his other hand, he wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. I burned my own wedding photos. Henry's eyes stung as they filled with smoke and soot, and he heard a woman yelling something in Japanese somewhere in the distance, and it sounded more like crying. We had a traditional wedding right here in Nihonmachi. We took our photos at the Washington Park Arboretum, in front of the magnolias and the rock roses. We wore kimonos and Shinto dressing that had been in my family for 3 generations. The photographer looked haunted by the scene in front of him, haunted by the destruction of touchable, tangible reminders of life. I burned it all. Henry had seen all he could take. Turning, he ran home, still tasting the smoke. Thank you. I like to read that scene because it's short, but it combines the fiction and the nonfiction together. And as I was doing my research, I found moments where I had to pause. And I grew up in Seattle. You would think growing up in Seattle, people would have a pretty clear understanding of the internment. Not so. My understanding was a mile wide and an inch deep. And so when I found moments like that of people burying their photos in the backyard or burning personal belongings, it was a moment when suddenly I realized I'm not just writing the story because I like to write and I enjoy the process, but it was something that suddenly I had a special reverence for. Before we jump to Q&A, I'm gonna touch upon the one question that always comes up, inevitably, and it's usually how much of my own story is in this book, how much of my dad's story or my grandfather's story, and while Hotel's not biographical or autobiographical, they definitely there's an emotional investment from each generation, I think, into the story. Starting with my grandfather. My grandfather my Chinese grandfather was 88 years old when my grandmother passed away. And they had been married for 60 years, give or take a couple years there. And, when someone loses their soulmate over more than half a century, I was very, all of us were concerned for my grandfather. And I was living at Seattle U at the time. My grandfather lives on Beacon Hill. It's a stone's throw away. And so I found myself spending a lot of time with my grandfather, just checking in on him, just see how he's doing, make sure he's okay. Whether it's listening, go over and listen to a baseball game on the radio or, go wash my car or something. Find some reason to kind of check in on him. And I was at my grandfather's house a year to the day of my grandmother's funeral, and he comes out of the bedroom, and he has a suitcase and a hat, and he says, "Take me to the airport, don't wait up for me." I know, right? I'm like, but I'm gonna be a good son, and I would never question my grandfather. So I took him to the airport. And the story was he was flying to New York to visit an old friend named Clarence. And I kept on thinking, I'm pretty sure I know Clarence. And he lives in Tacoma, Washington. Doesn't live in New York. Well, it turned out that Clarence was actually a woman named Amy. And he and Amy shacked up. And, more power to him. It turned out that Amy was someone that he had known decades earlier. The two couples knew each other. My grandmother had passed. Amy's husband had passed. They hadn't seen each other for years, and he was paying a call on Amy. and they ended up living together and spending the next 4 years together, and living in Sag Harbor, New York, and spending 1 week of every month in the city, going to Broadway shows, and had this really nice, I guess, I think the most that any of us can hope for in life is a really good third act. You know, he had a great third act. And to see him press the reset button on his heart, and that was a really beautiful thing. And those of you that have read Hotel, you can kind of see where that came from. What my father brought to the story more than anything was the I am Chinese button. My dad was a teenager going to public school right after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, and he was given one of those buttons to wear. His cousins wore those. A lot of people in the Chinese American community wore something similar. And my dad would talk about walking to school and the white kids throwing rocks at him, calling him a Jap, which is, it's a little confounding considering, China and Japan were somewhat at war for the previous 10 years. And those of you that read Hotel, that's where the button came from. And I guess what I brought to the story more than anything, and it pales in comparison to the historical gravitas of my dad and my grandfather, was just that abiding weakness for love stories. And there was the first love. And I was 15. I was James at 15, Jamie at 15. And I was pining away for this impossible girl. Pining, you say stalking, Let's not get hung up on semantics. But for whatever reason, she agreed to go to the homecoming dance with me. And this was my first real date, my first time in a tux, my first anything. And we had that quintessential Norman Rockwell cliche date, the corsage and the dance and the walk to the front step in the moonlight and that awkward first kiss with braces. It's really not so attractive in retrospect, but great date. And I remember getting in my car, and it's the Seattle area, and it's November or October. I'm driving away, it's raining, and I roll the window down, and I'm just like, yes, like I had just conquered Mount Everest. And I go to work the next day, and I was a busboy in a seafood restaurant, and I had to play with my schedule to get the night off. And so everyone I worked with knew I had this big date, and they all wanted dirt. They all wanted to know what happened, and I'm going to be a gentleman. I'm not going to talk about it. Meanwhile, the entire night, I'm walking around the restaurant, just grinning from ear to ear, So much so that all the waitresses got together and collectively decided I had just lost my virginity. And it was just a kiss, but sometimes a kiss is more than a kiss. And I have to just to close with, I told that story in the little town of Paulsbo, Washington, in an auditorium not quite this big. And as I was telling the story, I looked up, and she was there in the audience. And she was laughing her head off. And so with that, I think we're going to go over here, and we're going to do some Q&A.
We ask you all to submit questions ahead of time, and several readers have asked about what happens to the characters after the conclusion of the novel. Bernice, for example, wondered what you envision happening between Keiko and Henry. Do they get married in the new year? And likewise, Cheryl mentions that she was in New York during the September 11th anniversary and was tempted to find Keiko to find out herself if Keiko and Henry were living happily ever after. And so readers really do want to know.
Oh, and that's a very well-couched, disguised way of asking if there's a sequel or something like that. I don't mean to be coy, but I really don't know what happens next. And I think I like books that when they end, it's the beginning of a new story, and that story exists in the reader's minds. And that's where it sits now. And I've had some readers come up to me and say, I love the ending, and I picture them living happily ever after. And other people say, of course Henry could never be with her because of X, Y, Z, and you're so horrible for writing this tragic ending. So it's really up to you. And I don't really have plans for a sequel, because I think I could only screw it up at this point. So it's very special that the characters appear real, and they sometimes appear real to me, and I think about them once in a while. Never say never as far as a sequel, but I'm kind of fascinated by Keiko and those missing years, so perhaps one day there might be something there.
Yeah. Margaret mentions that she has a friend who lives in Seattle, and she sent your book to her friend, who then went to the Panama Hotel and saw this beautiful glass floor where you can see all the belongings of Japanese Americans that are still there, some of the belongings that are still there. Right. And so we wondered if you could tell us about the importance of the setting. You've talked about this some already, but a bit more about the importance of the physical and geographical setting of the novel. How did this very real place, this very real setting, shape the story of Henry and Keiko?
I think, like a lot of people, when they find out that the Panama Hotel is a real place, and the belongings of those families do indeed reside there in the basement, that's startling. It stops becoming this distant narrative that's you might have read about in a history book, and it's someone's home and hearth, their well-being disrupted, to say the least. And Hotel started as a short story. It started as a 30-page short story about the button and the characters of Henry and Keiko. And I'd met with an editor who encouraged me to turn it into a novel. And I wanted to give the book a redemptive ending, and that's kind of a literary way of saying happily ever after. But I mean, it's not happy like, rainbows and unicorns, but a redemptive quality to it. And I couldn't find, from my perspective, I couldn't find that redemptive ending in the 40s, because I think for Japanese families coming home from camp, that wasn't like a celebratory moment. It was like being released from prison on false charges. It wasn't, and you'd lost so much. And so I wanted to jump to the 80s. The 80s was a time period I knew well. It was when the redress was made. It was when the Sansei, third generation, began asking questions. And it just happened to be when the Panama Hotel changed owners. And so the hotel became this fixture with a foot in two time periods. And it just worked as this bridge between the past and the present. Plus, it has the gravity of being nonfiction, that it was a place where personal belongings were stored.
4 readers wondered about the letters between Henry and Keiko, and Cy, Audrey, Anna, and Tina are all wondering if Ethel was the one who intercepted the letters between Henry and Keiko. And Margaret wonders, in addition, that if this is so, was their entire marriage a fraud?
Wow. Wow. I feel like I'm like in the witness stand, I get asked this a lot, and especially by book groups, and I understand why. And I hate to be so coy, but I really don't know, because I never wrote any scenes from Ethel's point of view, so we never really see her internal monologue. I always saw Ethel as kind of an unwitting accomplice, and Henry loved Ethel, and he was going to sacrifice other things because he had made that commitment. And as far as Ethel, her complicity, I don't think so, but she's dead now, so you never know. She took it to the grave. That'll be the, coming out in January, the Ethel tapes. Yeah. My Sham Marriage by Ethel.
That's it. That's a wonderful response. Janet asks an interesting question about what English professors and teachers call authorial perspective. You are a relatively young man. You have more hair than I do, for example. And yet you have portrayed the voice of old Henry Lee, who is 56 years old, with layers of complexity. How did you discover and create this older voice of old Henry Lee in such a convincing fashion?
Oh, thanks. That's it's interesting because I think occasionally I get beat up because my characters their voices appear way older than their physical age, and I was really close to my grandfather, almost closer to my grandfather than my actual father, and the world that my father and my grandfather inhabited as young children and as young men does not exist anymore. And I feel like I was born 50 years, 60 years too late, because I hear all the stories, and then I go back, and this great place is now a Starbucks or something like that. You know, I miss that. I have an affinity for that, and so I guess it comes from that. I just sort of a longing for something I can never, you know, it's the past is smoke. I can see it, but I can never touch it, and I wish I could.
What a great conversation we've had this afternoon. Thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking Jamie Ford.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.